All right, so today we're going to talk about privacy in the new world of remote proctoring. As the COVID pandemic continues to affect the world, we have more and more remote learning and, of course, remote proctoring going on. And as part of that, because the field is still new and we're still dealing with newer regulations such as GDPR from Europe, privacy becomes more and more of concern. So I've gathered several industry experts to talk about the issues of privacy in the world of remote proctoring. And hopefully this webinar is useful for everyone that's listening in. A quick overview of the agenda. We're going to just have a quick welcome here by myself and then introduce the panelists. And then we've got time for some detailed discussion questions. And then at the end, we have time for Q&A from the audience. Brief introduction to ASE. If you're not familiar with ASE, we provide online assessment solutions, but we don't do remote proctoring ourselves. We partner with the leading remote proctoring firms, of which Don and Rachel are two of them. If you want to learn more about us, there is our website. And remote proctoring, just to start out with, it's a surprisingly wide field. When I first got into the topic, I wasn't aware that there were that many options, but there really are. When it comes down to the types of remote proctoring, some organizations or vendors that do AI only, some that do AI plus humans, some that do human review only, meaning they record videos and let humans review it later, some that do live humans where they provide the proctors, and some provide a live human platform where you do your own, which is bring your own proctor. And of course, there's a lot of software and hardware differences between these two, such as being like a Chrome plugin versus a new installable piece of software, it being standalone versus only working with LMSs, or it being high bandwidth versus low bandwidth. And that's it for my brief intro. Now I'll let Don and Rachel introduce themselves. Don, you want to go first?
Sure. Don Kastner, the president of MonitorEDU, been in the proctoring industry since probably 2008, 2009. And so I've got a lot of experience. I've seen the industry go through a lot of changes over the last 13, 14 years, definitely a lot in the last 2 years. So very excited to share my thoughts.
Thanks, and I'll go ahead and jump in and go next, Nate. I'm Rachel Schoenig. I'm the CEO of Cornerstone Strategies, and I have the privilege of serving as the Chief Science Officer for Examity. I'm actually an attorney by trade and came into the testing industry by way of the tire industry, believe it or not. But actually spent a lot of time talking with my clients about privacy and about security and how to ensure that the testing experience is not only a positive one in terms of the results that it yields from a valid score result, but also a positive experience for the test takers and the test sponsors as well. So really happy to be here because, as Don said, the last 2 years have been incredibly impactful in our industry. And even more broadly, I think the privacy side of things, isn't just impacting our industry, it's impacting everyone. So really great time to, I think, have a conversation about this topic. So thanks for getting us together, Nate.
You're very welcome. With that, I'll start off with the first question, and that is, what do you think is the most important issue when it comes to privacy in online proctoring? Don, you want to take this first one?
Sure. In thinking about this, really it's the amount of data that we're collecting, because it can be pretty intrusive. We're taking video, audio. In some cases, we're downloading programs on computers, collecting computer data, we're collecting personal data. So you compare that, you've got all these issues with security, and then there's all these issues with privacy. You mentioned GDPR, we've got laws in California. And so really it's minimizing that data. One of the big concerns for me from the beginning also is the amount of video data that we store, because in many cases you're testing people in their home, sometimes in their bedroom, in their office. So there's a lot of personal space that we're recording. And you typically record people at a very stressful time. And so behaviors can be odd. We've seen a lot of different things. And those are things I worry about. Somebody has a breakdown on camera and that's recorded. And are we protecting that video evidence? And so for me, those are things that we as a company have to think about, protecting that person, because the last thing we'd want is for somebody's video to somehow leak out there in that situation and embarrass them. And I know that there are people that worry about that, that have had a breakdown on camera And now they're not just concerned about their test, they're concerned about that video being out there in ether somewhere or somebody watching it. So there's a lot of data we have to think about, and a lot of data that we should really minimize in terms of collection.
Nate, can I jump in there too? I think some of it depends on from whose perspective, because I really like what Don said, from the testing vendor perspective, those are right, spot on in terms of here's what I'm worried about. I think from the test taker's perspective, they're just starting from the basic, what are you doing and why, right? And so, there, I think part of the issue is just trying to help them understand what kind of data we are collecting, the amount of control they really have over some of that data, and why it's important for the testing vendor to know that. I think the other thing that I would throw out there is that while some of the data that's being collected through online proctoring during an online testing event is different, a lot of it is similar to what a testing vendor would collect regardless of where you're testing at, right? So some of the names, some of the email, some of that kind of stuff. So in many ways, while we talk about it as though it's unique and new to the online proctoring space, it really isn't. It's something that across the industry, whether people are delivering tests online and using online proctoring, or in test centers, or in pop-up test events, these are all issues that testing programs should really be thinking about and talking about with their vendors as well as their test takers, because there's a lot of data that we capture in our industry, and even more honestly than just what we see in the proctoring space. So these are just really important conversations that testing programs should be having internally, as I said, with their vendors, and eventually communicating with their test takers as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. When you get into like employment testing and certification testing, they know a lot about the candidate, their educational history, where they worked, you name it.
Yeah, really great point. Yeah, so, and oftentimes that's information that the testing vendor doesn't have, right? As an online proctoring provider, or even a delivery vendor, right? We don't need some of that information, but for certification and licensure exams, even admissions exams, they may have things like information around someone's accommodations needs, right? And some of the doctor's information. That's not something that a test vendor would need to have necessarily. They might need to be told this person needs a reader, but they don't need all the background information or anything like that. So just to think broadly about the fact that our industry really does have a lot of information, sometimes a lot of sensitive information that needs to be protected under the various privacy laws that are, cropping up in North America as well as around the globe, I think is really important.
Yeah, I totally agree. Next question I had was, how is AI best applied in the world of remote proctoring? Rachel, you want to start?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. I would start by saying carefully, very carefully,
Yes.
because there are, as new as online proctoring is, and it really is, relatively nascent, right? It's kind of a baby in the testing world when you think about it. AI is almost embryonic, right? It's so new in terms of what it can do, not just in our industry, but around the world. And we are learning kind of as we go what some of the strengths and what some of the weaknesses are when it comes to AI. So my first caution would be very carefully. My second recommendation would be, when you're thinking about AI, is to really ask a lot of questions. Understand, we are doing right now at Examity a lot of research on AI and the use of algorithms, because you really want to understand, how was the AI developed? How was it trained? What kind of data sets were used in the training? What is it going to tell you? What is it not going to tell you? And again, in terms of the privacy of the data that it is, relying on, and that it's being trained on, understanding what, the different, without getting into specifics on who the people are involved, understanding the different demographics that the AI was tested with. I think the other thing that's really important right now is that we're starting to see in the privacy landscape, for one, a lot of different jurisdictions putting laws out there that are, from a legal perspective, what we would call as extraterritorial. In other words, just because, for example, California may have a law doesn't mean it wouldn't apply to a company that's situated in Rhode Island if they have test takers that are in California, or same with GDPR. And there are a lot of extraterritorial laws cropping up, China, Brazil. There's a lot of new regulations out there when it comes to privacy. In the same way, we're starting to see new regulations crop up around the use of AI, which is a really broad term. And I think when we think about AI and testing, again, it's not just limited to what is potentially available in the proctoring space. There's a lot of opportunity to apply AI, for example, with automated item generation. Can you use artificial intelligence for automated item generation? Can you use artificial intelligence for scoring and marking exams? So there's a lot of opportunities for us to effectively employ AI across the testing life cycle, not just during the time that the test taker is interacting and being observed, interacting with the test content, but all of those need to really be thoughtfully researched and thoughtfully applied. And then typically what we're seeing is you really want to have human involvement in the AI. So you don't necessarily want the AI just to automatically make a decision. You want to have the AI perhaps flag it, but then you want a human to apply human judgment in making the final decision. So Don, I don't know, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, actually, as you were talking about it, I was thinking, because most people who know me know I'm not a big fan of it within remote proctoring for a number of different reasons. But if you think about data, you think about AI, the types of data where it's appropriate is really statistical data, right? It's hard data, it's numbers, things that we can crunch, things that you can put through the algorithms. If you think about remote proctoring, it's observational data, right? So we're trying to apply AI to observations. And so what you end up getting just in the true remote proctoring where you're trying to identify behavior is you get all of these flags that say, well, this behavior was odd, but that's observational. And so it's very difficult and challenging. As you mentioned, AI is in an embryonic stage. And so, we've tried to apply it to remote proctoring to make decisions. And it doesn't work very well because of the high rates of flagging. And so I get into test validity, I get into the efficacy of the remote proctoring process when you rely solely on that type of data to determine whether or not somebody has committed a rules violation or infraction. It really does need that human observation. And so if you take something and you just create AI data or data on it that has all of these flags and somebody looks at it after the fact, I'm worried about the boy who cries wolf syndrome, where you've got 70% or 80% where it's benign, right? Where the flag is irrelevant. And so if you're as a human looking at that, at some point, you're going to get, lazy. That we're humans, we do that, right? We have good things and bad things, right? The good thing is we can make observations and judgment. The bad thing is if we see the same thing over and over and it keeps telling us that it's a false flag, we're going to start to not look at the ones we should look at. And so I look at it, and I like when we started talking about this 8 or 9 years ago within remote proctoring, it was that sort of proctoring assisted technology. So if I'm looking at a series of 6 or 7 videos, somebody does something weird. Now my eyes may catch it, but at that moment, maybe I'm distracted talking to somebody else. So that screen starts flashing and says, hey, Proctor, there's something you need to take a look at here. And those were the kinds of technologies that I'm a fan of, because that helps the proctor do a better job. It identifies where their attention should be. So really, going back to your point, you did a great job of covering all the legal aspects, and really where AI applies, and that's a lot of stuff that Nate does on the back end with hard and fast data. But on the proctoring side, because it's observational, AI is just not ready yet to be the prime driver.
Yeah, and I suppose when you get down to predictive validity of those machine learning models in the AI, there are certain observation things that it can do well, but so many that it can't do well. It's easy to see if there's a face missing out of a screen, right? I mean, that's been in AI for over a decade. But if you're talking about somebody frequently glancing down at their hands because they got a cheat sheet, yeah, I'm not sure how. Yeah, exactly. You're not going to be 100% on something like that, right?
Right. I mean, I look at my keyboard to type even after all these years. So.
Yeah, exactly. So you're going to be false flagged all the time just for typing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think we have to remember that in some ways, AI is still very simple. So to your point, Nate, it's, kind of 0-1. Is there a face in the screen? Is there a face not in the screen? But AI doesn't have judgment. People have judgment. And that's why that is such an important marriage of, sure, technology can be helpful, but technology does not have judgment right now. And I think trying to use AI as a flag to say this is something wrong when, there's a lot of reasons I might be looking at it. I might, feel like there's a fly that just landed on my leg, or I might, to Don's point, need to chicken peck on my keyboard. I think that's where the human judgment is just so invaluable. And I have spent a lot of time thinking and talking with different proctors, some of whom are doing hybrid right now. So they are both testing in their test center. I feel really strongly about the value that organizations like NCTA, for example, bring. There's a lot of testing offices that are testing remotely and doing online proctoring, as well as testing people in their test centers. And it really does come down to having a professional trained proctor who, Donna, like how you said it, AI assist. If we're using some of that simple AI, even just to say, oh, what just happened? Don just left the screen, proctor, pay attention here. It still leaves lots of room and lots of opportunity, I think, in really positive, important ways for that human judgment to be applied and to understand, is there something that I really need to be concerned about here? Or is this what I would consider normal testing taking behavior for this particular candidate? So just want to follow up with that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I totally agree. Our next question, let's see, is what are some of the best practices in live proctoring to prevent examinee privacy?
Well, I guess I'll go first this time. So, sure. Going back to, the first question, we talked about all of the data that runs through. I mean, I think Rachel hit the nail on the head. There's only so much data that we need to do our jobs effectively. And so the first thing is identifying what we need to be able to proctor effectively, right? So that we can assure it's the right candidate, so that we know that they're following the rules, that they're not getting, any assistance from either materials or from other people, right? That we've got the security built in. And so as a test vendor and a proctoring company, you've got to take a look at it and say, what's the minimal amount of data I need to do my job effectively, right? And then you can take that data and then compare it to the laws to figure out how you're handling it. So am I compliance with GDPR? Am I compliance with California law? Am I compliance with other laws that are being discussed? Because, I mean, the world is changing and a lot of things are going to change. You look at AI, there's a lot of movement in Congress to regulate that differently. So really focusing on, number one, let's minimize what we collect. Number two, let's talk about how we handle what we collect to make sure we're in compliance. And then number three, going back to what Rachel said about the candidate, let's be transparent so that they understand. We don't record a lot of video, which is probably not a surprise to people. And so I'll get candidates asking them to delete their video. It's like, we obviously didn't do a good job at the beginning, letting you know that we don't actually record unless you do something that's worth recording. So, really being transparent so they understand and they're comfortable with the process. So I think those three things, making sure we identify at minimum what we need, making sure we're in compliance, and then the transparency with the candidate. So those are the three things that every test organization and proctoring company should be doing.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I suppose if I didn't realize the wide amount of variation in remote proctoring, the candidates certainly aren't. So if they are only used to one of those, AI recording only remote proctoring vendors from their college days that was integrated with Blackboard, something like what Examity and MonitorEDU is completely new to them. They're not used to that kind of remote proctoring, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and I think, the other thing we can do is remind the candidates that they have a lot of choice. Typically, in terms of where they choose to test. So if Don didn't want us to see the jersey hiding behind him, then pick a different room to test in, right? And I don't mean to make it sound that simplistic, because I know right now, especially with the coronavirus, it's really difficult for people to, necessarily find the places that they can test. But we do remind folks that, if they have a library that they can go to, or there's oftentimes, especially in the certification and licensure side, maybe an office that they can go to as opposed to testing from home, so that if they feel uncomfortable providing visibility into their living space, that there are other options for them as well. And I think part of that is that transparency that Don was talking about, right? Like, we will see where you're seated. We will see the area around you. So, think about where you want, where you want to take that exam, so that you're being thoughtful about what would be exposed to us during that session. And again, I don't mean to be flippant about the fact that there are lots of challenges right now during coronavirus and dealing with the pandemic that make it difficult for people to leave. Oftentimes, there's more than one person staying in a location that makes it difficult for people to find a quiet space. If we were in a typical situation, it would, it'd work a little bit easier to say that. But I do think it's important that we remind test takers that, they have a lot of control over that environment typically, and what we're able to see in that environment as they're setting that up for their exam. So.
Yeah, and it's really up to them to control the environment, and
as much as they can, right? Yeah, as much as they can. Yeah, and I think what Don said about best practices, that was spot on. Really well delivered. I think it's important for testing programs who are online right now to think about what data are you collecting, and then what data does your vendor need to collect to be able to do what you're asking your vendor to do. Your vendor is a small sliver of a much broader process that the testing program is setting up to interact with not just the test taker, but also the score users at the end of the day. And so, being really thoughtful about knowing your own data, knowing what kind of data you will or will not transfer to your vendor, what kind of data your vendor is collecting, and what they're doing with that data is really important. And then, to Don's point, just be very transparent, communicate it in a way that allows a test taker to then make an informed decision about whether this is an event that they want to participate in at this time. I think that's really important. At the end of the day, it's really coming down to helping the test taker understand what is going to be expected of them during that event. So
yeah, that's a good point. To know that somebody will be watching you, but we're not recording you. That's
right.
a pretty important thing to start off with.
Right. Or we will be watching you and we will be recording you. Here's how long your data is going to be retained. Here's what's going to happen to your data. Right. There's all sorts of different ways that online proctoring or in-person proctoring takes place. Let's not forget that test centers oftentimes record what's happening at a test center as well. So, making sure that test takers understand what's happening during that test event and what happens with the data that's captured, I think is important regardless of how you're delivering your exam. And there's, again, kind of going back to what we talked about before, there's a lot more data oftentimes that is collected by the testing program that test takers will have questions about. So when we're thinking about privacy, we want to make sure that the testing programs are thinking broadly about the kind of data that they're collecting, not just, kind of the sliver of data that your vendor may be collecting to help, in that whole testing life cycle.
Yeah, I've talked about this with Don before, in that the proctoring is really about managing the environment and the identity at the beginning, whereas the rest of the data is typically the domain of the testing platform or the vendor the test sponsor themselves. And they need to understand the fit of those two sets of data and just how much more there is on the one side than there is on the environment and initial identification. And that's a good point too about the live proctoring centers or in-person proctoring centers. I mean, they recorded video, and they also would take in identity verification process too.
Right.
When examinees, they might scan a copy of driver's license or something like that too. And they were potentially doing more in terms of gathering information about the examinees than the current remote proctoring approach does.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, when you think about why we do what we do at this phase of the testing life cycle, right? It's really to try and make sure we're getting the right test to the right person, and that they're taking it under the conditions that the test was designed for. So if it's not an open book test, we don't want you to have an open book. If you're not supposed to collaborate with someone, we don't want you to collaborate. And I think that at the end of the day is really, it goes back to that test sponsor, making sure that they understand why they have the rules that they have in place, why they have, stressed the conditions that they have in place. And that, regardless of whether you're taking it online, whether you're taking it at a pop-up test center, whether you're taking it at a brick and mortar test center that delivers these exams all year round, those underlying needs for the exam, they don't really change. How we might capture that data, for example, a test center may capture biometric data, right? Like a palm vein scan. Those are things that from a biometric perspective, potentially from an AI perspective, have far more restrictive data security needs around it and privacy requirements around it that we would certainly want our test takers and any test sponsor out there to be aware of. But all of them are taken for the same sort of general principles, which is we have different points in time where we can collect data that at the end of the day means that when the test sponsor delivers a score report, a credential, whatever it is, that there's confidence in the validity of that final representation of someone's competencies. And that people who rely on that for educational purposes, scholarship purposes, hiring purposes, are able to have confidence in that. And at this phase, to your point, there's clearly that authentication of the individual. Do we have the right person with the right test? And then there's all sorts of other data points that tell us that the test occurred as we would have expected it to have occurred. And, the test vendor certainly does not have all those data points. It needs to provide what they observed, what information came through during that event to the test sponsor so that they could ultimately make a decision with all that broader data, to your point, Nate, some of the psychometric information that's going to come through, some of the other statistical data that can get analyzed to ultimately make a decision that this is a score report or credential that they can stand behind for this particular individual when it's granted. And that's a really broad process. So
yeah. And I really like the beginning of what you were talking about there of making sure that everyone's following the rules about being open book or not, that sort of thing. It comes back to the original definition of a standardized test. The phrase standardized test gets a bad rap a lot, especially in the USA. But it really comes down to saying we want it to be fair. We want to standardize how the test is delivered to make sure that everyone follows the rules about whether it be an open book or, not leaving for breaks where you're not supposed to leave for breaks, and so many other things that go into delivering a test and making sure the environment is appropriate. Yeah.
Right. Unless you have an accommodation, you shouldn't get 2 hours more to take your exam than Don did. Right.
Yeah, exactly. So. And that's standardized testing. Yep. All right. Don, any additional reply on that?
No, I was just going to say that Nate would take half the time because he's much smarter than me.
Thanks, Don. I don't think so. All right. I've got one more question on our list, and we can move to Q&A. I saw we have one waiting for us there. Where are we headed with online proctoring these days, especially where things like GDPR and the territorial laws, like you were talking about, Rachel, where are they pushing us as a field?
Do you want me to start? I think it's pushing us to what I anticipate to be a hybrid model. I think even if you have a test sponsor who is absolutely adamant that they want their exams to be taken at a test center with with proctors in the room, that there will be needs for from accommodations purposes for people to have the opportunity to test from home. That may be I can't leave because I have I'm undergoing cancer treatment and I have a reduced immune system, I have anxiety and I need to be able to test in my home, right? So from an accommodations perspective, I think there's an accessibility opportunity that online testing and online proctoring opens the door to that maybe haven't been available to people in the past. I also think that even if a test sponsor is committed to wanting to deliver tests through an online proctor and online learning perspective, there may be needs that people need to go to a test center or some kind of more physical location due to some of the things we were talking about before, right? Like I have 8 roommates and, you know, one of them has a toddler and it's just not quiet here and I can't get the space here. So I'm going to go to, maybe it's a test center, maybe it's a, you know, a library that I can get to. But I think that there's kind of this need to recognize that having the option for test takers is really valuable. So they can make a choice for what is best for them right now. We haven't really talked about accessibility, but I do think it's important that we think about accessibility as we look into our future and think about both from an accommodations perspective around disability, as well as accessibility from a technology standpoint. There are still places, including in the United States, where we don't have the bandwidth to allow people to test from home, and they may need to, you know, have an opportunity to go to a library or a test center where the bandwidth is reliable and they can take a 3-hour exam without having to worry about, you know, getting booted off because they just don't have the appropriate bandwidth, or they may not have the technology that would allow them to do that. So again, having a test center where that technology is available is really important. At the same time, when we think about what online proctoring opens up to us, certainly the pandemic has underscored the fact that accessibility in terms of being able to just sit down and take your test is opened up by having the option to test with online proctoring. And I think that is something that our industry has recognized and certainly sees the opportunity for that to continue to grow and continue to make testing more accessible to people who maybe didn't have opportunities in the past to afford the travel to a test center, afford the ability to you know, spend the night for a 3-hour exam, a 3-day exam, and now they can take that exam from home, for example, and reduce some of the costs and expenses that they may have had to incur traveling to a test center and spending the night and things like that. So I think we're going to continue to see a hybrid and continue to see test sponsors become more aware of the different needs of test takers, so that they're providing options that allow for accessibility to the different credentials and assessment results that we offer. So, Don, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of excited that you talked about that, because that's something that I've seen over the last year with the pandemic, because so many more people have been forced into remote testing that haven't tested before. And so, you know, one of the things that I've talked about in terms of accessibility is if you arrive at a test center and you meet all the requirements, you get to take that test, right? Very few situations where something happens, you know, maybe there's a disaster that happens, but by and large, 99.99% of people are able to sit and take that test as a result of that. In the online world, that hasn't been the case for some of the things that you've talked about in terms of technology, things that fall apart. But the flip side is you talk about special needs. As somebody who needs an accommodation, somebody who has some barrier in front of them, maybe a physical barrier, a mental barrier, where they actually can't go to the test center to test, right? So this is the reverse situation. They go to the test center, they're not able to test because the test center can't accommodate them and can't meet their needs. And we can do that in the online world, right? There's things that we can do. We can be a lot more flexible. We can manage different streams of technology. You know, if they've got screen readers at home on their equipment, we can now allow them to test on their equipment because they've already got the tools. Mm-hmm. So it significantly reduces the cost for, you know, the test provider, right, and increases the access for the test takers. So I agree in terms of the hybrid model. I think, you know, obviously remote proctoring is going to grow. I think this has become a Zoom world, you know, for us. We're all sort of getting used to this, you know, environment. And so, you know, it will address all those issues from a testing standpoint, and it will allow us to expand our reach, and it will allow us to make sure we've got that equity, you know, and we can do all those other things. And we can talk about markets, we can talk about, you know, technologies and all of those things. But really what I've seen the last year is the things that you've been talking about. So I'm actually excited to hear somebody else talk about it, because we haven't been able to get together in conferences and talk about it. So yeah, I think accessibility and equity big drivers of this industry in the next few years.
Yeah, and I would throw out, if you believe in the value of testing, which I think we do, because that's why we're in our industry, and the good that having measurement opportunities can provide for people, whether that's opening academic doors, scholarship doors, career doors, having people have access to those measurement opportunities where there's fewer barriers in front of them is, as John said, really exciting. I think this is a super exciting time, honestly, to be in the testing industry, because we are able to touch so many more lives in really positive ways, and provide opportunities for people that, for a lot of different reasons, may not have been able to access some of those opportunities. And I think it's really exciting to start to think about what that means for us. I also think it's not just a vendor question. So it's not just a question of, are you taking your test online? Or are you going to take it in person? This really gives us an opportunity to think about how we're designing our tests, how we're measuring, what we're actually looking to measure. Are there different ways that we could do that now that we are leveraging technology differently? And I think that's also really exciting, because I think it really, can serve as a catalyst for us. We are, for all sorts of really good reasons, a slow-moving industry. And we should be. The way we touch lives, the way we impact lives. I like to remind people that, having technology because you want to put your pictures online, if that goes down for a little bit, okay, I'm not saying it's great. I'm just saying, okay, move fast and break something there. But when it comes to someone's future, when it comes to someone's, academic or career opportunities, I don't want to break that. So there's reasons that, we spend time looking at the technology and thinking carefully about what we should integrate and how we should integrate it. Kind of going back to the research that we talked about from an algorithmic standpoint, Nate, and, thinking about how should we integrate that? What is the best way for us to do that? Not just with online proctoring, but across the board when it comes to assessment and reporting. So it's an exciting time. And I think the pandemic has definitely increase the rate of change and the opportunities that we need to be looking at out there, not just for delivery, but really for test design.
Yeah, you're right. There's other opportunities there, like making everybody type a short essay and doing keystroke analysis or something like that. We're gathering data about them to do that, but it's a different type of data than, taking a video of their bedroom.
Right. Yeah. Even things like, how long does your test really need to be? Right. It's how often should you be offering breaks? Do we need to rethink that if someone's testing from home versus in a test center? What's the navigation like? Should people be able to go back and forth? Is that, should we be rethinking how we're allowing that or not allowing that, given, testing from home versus testing at a pop-up test center, those types of things. So just gives us an opportunity to really reconsider some of the things that testing programs can do to still deliver valid results, and at the same time create a measurement experience that is a positive one for the test taker. And I spent a lot of time talking with clients about that. There's just a lot of things that we can do that can make things a better experience, more secure, less data, if we are willing to rethink what we're doing with the with the exam design itself.
Yeah, that's such a great point. The industry was fairly strongly against remote proctoring 5 years ago. I'm thinking from like the high stakes exam. So remote proctoring certainly used a lot in like universities 5 years ago. But then there was such a huge switch with the COVID pandemic towards how like certification and employment testing viewed remote proctoring. And now when the pandemic will hopefully subside in the future, we have an opportunity to somehow take a hybrid approach, like you said.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, then we have a Q&A waiting for us. It is, what's the best way to balance privacy and security for remote online exams? John, you want to take this?
Yeah, I'll start off. I mean, it's, we talked about, the strategies in terms of data collection, in terms of transparency, those are critical. One of the things that we've talked about is understanding the different pieces. So from a remote proctoring standpoint, we're focused on the candidate security and environment security. The tool should be focused on the exam security and the computer security. Having the lockdown browsers, having tests that the proctor can have controls over to, pause, start, stop, do those things. Having the ability to intervene not just with the candidate, but with the test. Having the ability to assess, whether people are running programs that they shouldn't be running. So, in a test center, you can control all of the computers. When you're testing at home, you can't. And so we have to modify slightly how we're delivering that test and make sure we've got the right tools. Other things I'm sure that Rachel knows a lot more about, but in terms of test data banks, having, a very broad and diverse, test data bank, because if you have a static list of 100 items, right, and that's it, those items are going to get out. They were already getting out in the test center because people were memorizing them and going and talking about them, right? And so you still have that same risk, online, and even more so because you throw technology on top of it. So you have to think through those things and understand it's a total solution. It's not just dependent on the proctoring vendor. They're one small piece. It's also on the test delivery vendor, and it's also on the test sponsor to determine, how they're going to put those pieces together. Rachel's got lots more experience than I do in test delivery side of it, so I'm sure she's got some great comments to add.
I think that you actually did a great job. I was going to give the typical attorney answer of it depends, which is a really frustrating answer, but I think it really does come down to how your test is designed, how you're delivering your exam. Don mentioned if you just have 100 items and you're delivering it in a linear form and you've been using that form for the last 2 years, if your test has value, it's already out. I'll just say that. So I think you really need to think of all of these different capabilities that the test sponsor, the test driver, the proctor, whether that's online or in person, what all of the different security layers that those bring you. And sometimes, you're going to make calculated risks. You're going to make judgment about whether you should or shouldn't collect some data because it, might be useful for security, but from a privacy perspective, you would prefer not to have that under your purview. And it is always kind of a balancing act. I have this really corny way that I say it where I tell people, look, I can promise you perfect privacy, never collect any data around anyone. And I can promise you perfect security, never deliver your test. Neither one of those are great solutions. So, kind of recognizing that there's really no way out of this pickle. You always have to balance those. In the balancing act, it's okay if your testing program makes a different decision about that than another testing program. You just want to make sure that those decisions are informed and that you understand what the downstream consequences are of them. So if you feel like it's important for your program to collect sensitive private data because you need that for other reporting purposes, maybe to an agency, a government agency that you report to or something else like that, and they are asking for that, just recognize then you may have to put additional information security capabilities in place to protect that and additional processes and procedures in place to protect that data. If you are thinking you're willing to forgo certain data, but it may have an impact on some of your security measures that you have in place, for example, authentication, then think about, are there other ways that you can satisfy your authentication needs? And if not, are there ways that you can check at the back end that make that a little more likely that you had the right person on the right test? So it's just, it's not something that I think testing programs should feel like they're in a bind about. I think it's something that they should feel like they have multiple ways to meet their needs. And it does in some ways come down to their own kind of risk tolerance and their honestly their own demographics, like who takes your exam, where is it delivered, things like that. So
yeah, and the stakes of the exam stack very widely too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yep. And then the whole equity question we had brought up before gets into the mix too of, how many accommodations are you making for different types of the subpopulation? Okay, we have another question here. In your experience, have you seen measurable differences in the performance of individuals testing in person versus remotely for the same examination? Have either of you been involved in research projects comparing live versus remote?
Yes. Don, do you want to go first or do you want me to jump in?
I'll let you go first.
Okay, so the answer is yes and no. Again, some testing programs have not seen measurable differences. They have seen, and they continue to monitor from a high stakes perspective how individuals are performing on their exam. But the differences have not been measurable, and they're very comfortable with continuing with online proctoring or maybe a hybrid model. Other clients that I have had have seen a measurable difference, not, where they're this far apart, but where there is enough to say there's a statistically significant difference in them. And they're continuing to monitor how they are addressing those, those differences. So in some, yes, and in some, no. Don, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, what we've been talking about is the different variables and how you set it up, the different sacrifices that you make. And so that's another piece of it. You need to do the item analysis, the statistical analysis on the exams and find out where you have differences and then try to identify why. If it's an item that's performing differently, we've got our psychometricians, we're going to deal with that. We're going to look into it. If the test scores are different because the environments are different or the test centers are different, let's figure out why and change the protocols. Every test is not the same, right? Every process is not the same. And so it may be that you just need to make a few adjustments to the process to balance those things out. And so you just don't say, well, we're going to throw the whole thing away because the data tells us we have a difference. No, that's why we're looking at the data, to identify the differences and then to make those corrections over time.
Yeah, it's certainly possible that a few minor changes in, the check-in process or viewing somebody's room when they check in could change the pass rate for the remote proctored exams, right?
Yeah, and look, people do like to gain an advantage. Okay, we all do. I don't like to say people are cheating because I think people generally are honest, but they will look for an advantage, a way to perform, and they share information with people, right? And so we have to stay ahead of that. We have to pay attention. They may find, hey, there's a little opportunity here to take advantage of the situation because there's something I can't see. In this video right here, I mean, we talked about typing earlier. I could have my phone out and be looking stuff up, right? So we identify those holes and we correct them. And guess what? Another hole will open up and then someone will figure it out and then we have to correct that. So it's not just, set it and forget it. It's about continuing to evaluate. That's where the AI comes in, right? That's where the statistical analysis, the psychometrics, all of that comes into play so that we can continually stay on top of how we're delivering those exams, how we're providing that security and the things that we can do to make sure that everything's level and ultimately everything's valid.
Yeah, let me just throw in, so I have, as in-house. So when I came into the testing industry, I was working for a test sponsor and they delivered exams, some through test centers, some through what I'll call pop-up test centers. And I can tell you that I had a full-time staff kept busy full-time following up on score validity concerns because people either were taking items and circulating them, circulating answers, receiving assistance during the exam, sending in surrogates during the exam. It's not like security incidents have only come up when we went online. Security incidents have been a thing for a long time, and there is no test center that's 100% secure other than that option I gave you before, which is write your exam and lock it in a closet. That is mostly secure. Completely horrible business model. But there is no 100% secure way to deliver an exam. And we have to understand that there are so many places through that life cycle of the exam, starting honestly with your item writers and item reviewers, right? I mean, there are cases out there where the item reviewer was looking at the content before it had ever been delivered, before there was even field testing on it, and sharing that with test prep entities. So this is not a new issue. it's not only a test delivery issue. And certainly modifying things when it comes to the testing process, to the test itself, to the item banks, to the number of forms you have, or the item pool, or moving from linear to CAT, all of those things are constantly being evaluated regardless of how someone, or should be, I should say it like that, regardless of how someone is taking the exam, whether it's online at home or online at a test center or paper and pencil at a pop-up test center. All of those things continue to be important for a testing sponsor to evaluate on a periodic but fairly regular basis to make sure, are there other adjustments that we need to make? So it kind of goes back to what Don said, as you're evaluating the data coming in, looking at the different types of incidents that you're discovering or that you're seeing, you do need to modify it. But that, I will tell you, is not just something you should be doing when you go to online testing. It's something that you should be doing all the time for your testing program.
Yeah,
So,
you're absolutely right. Since we've had security breaches as long as there has been tests.
Yep.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay. All right, only a couple minutes left now. I'll give this opportunity for each you to say, a closing statement, and also give information about your company and yourself, how to reach you if anybody's interested in learning more about your expertise or your products.
I love that. All right, Don, you go first.
Sure. First of all, thank you. I really enjoyed this. It was nice sitting down and talking with a group again. I've missed that in the last year and a half, and so this is great. Nate, keep putting these together. So to get a hold of me, Doncaster, Don at MonitorEDU. We're just a live remote proctoring company. We've been around for about 4 or 5 years now. We're primarily with high stakes assessments. We've been doing a lot in accessibility the last year. 90% of our business is non-higher ed, so it kind of goes back to what you were talking about in terms of how remote proctoring is expanding. So, and if anyone's got any questions, I don't mind even just getting on the phone and talking and chatting and giving you my ideas like we would over coffee. So again, thanks, Nate, and thanks, Rachel. This was great.
I agree. It was a lot of fun. It was really good to see you all again too. So definitely missing our times, able to get together at different conferences. So mine is a little more confusing than Don. So I'll spell it. So it's R, S is in Sam, C is in Charlie, H is in horse, O is in Oscar, E is in egg, N is in Nancy, I is in ice cream, G is in girl. R Shanig at examity.com. And I would be very happy, as Don said, to just kind of talk with you about, your thoughts on this. There's lots of other things that we could, help you think about when it comes to either going online or staying online, joining kind of that hybrid world that I think we'll be looking at going forward here. As I said before, feel really passionately about what we do, and I'm really grateful to, folks like Don and Nate for getting us together and having these conversations, and everybody who's participating, just because I think it really does help our industry improve and help us to deliver the value, the important information that we need to get out there into the world. So glad to have this time together, and thanks again, Nate, for doing that.
You're very welcome. Thank you both for joining the webinar.
Okay.
I found it very much enjoyable too.
Bye,
all right. Thank you all, the participants too. Thank you for joining the webinar. And everybody have a great day.
Thanks.
Bye.